slot, I propose a longue durée history of food security in the African continent. Now this is something we surprisingly lack because the focus has been somewhat different, but the ingredients really are all there. The African continent is home to some of the richest environmental histories that are out there. They critique, of course, the negativity and simplicity with which African agriculture has typically been viewed, and it's on these critiques that I essentially build. The time depth of many of these studies, however, remains confined mostly to periods characterized by intensive engagements with Europeans, making it difficult to unravel African agricultural capabilities prior to their interventions. Food history requires creative use of an array of sources beyond the written word, especially in parts of the continent that lack early or extensive written archives. But Africanists have long been innovators in making histories using a diverse array of source material. Over the last 2 decades, there has been a strong resurgence in interest in Africa's long-term economic history, a charge which has so far been led by economic historians interested in a so-called reversal of fortunes post-1500. But they and others have remained frustrated by the lack of data prior to colonial records. So in this talk, I make an explicit call for using archaeological data, particularly since we've seen an explosion of work on the last 500 years. So archaeological data extends our food security archive in several critical ways. One of the big ones is that we can examine most any time period. Our data are also the material remains of people's everyday activities, which provides a much different perspective than documentary sources, which often speak from a different set of biases. While I don't have time to go into the specific details here, over the last few years I've developed an approach that harnesses these advantages in order to track changing levels of food security over time. I argue we can document changes particularly in food availability, access, and preference to reconstruct food security over time. While I can't go into this method or approach in detail today, I do definitely welcome questions at the end or during the seminar that follows. But the counter-narrative I present today depends in large part on this reconstruction. So while we can't quite get the same kind of resolution on foodways that we might from ethnographic accounts, there are multiple sources of archaeological data that can help us reconstruct foodways. For those who are not archaeologists in the room, I wanted to visualize what these kinds of data might look like. So if we take this tranquil kitchen scene from 2009, we fast forward a few centuries, archaeologically what would be left are remains of houses like this one, and there's a wall there where the scale bar is. Above that is a white sort of plastered interior floor, and below that is an external sort of charcoal-rich area that was probably the kitchen. So we can look at the kinds of activities, including food storage and food preparation, that people performed in these spaces. We can also look at the pots people used to cook food in, the residues that adhered in those, as well as the shape and size of pots to reconstruct some general food practices. My personal favorite, and clearly the most photogenic, seeds and other bits charred in cooking fires, which is going to be my focus today, as well as plant microfossils like phytoliths and starch grains. Additionally, we can also examine, I'll talk about these data a little bit today, animal bones left over from people's meals. So this is not the limit of the kinds of archaeological data that can speak to food, but it sources sort of the nuts and bolts that I'm going to rely on today. So the focus of my fieldwork and the case study that really energizes the book at its core is a place called Bandha, located in central Ghana, and highlighted here by a little black square. The area was ideal for this kind of a study for several reasons. It's really a rarity on the African continent, and that there's been sustained archaeological work there for several decades under the leadership of Anne Stahl. I was particularly fortunate that she had the foresight to sample for crop remains. This is a source of data that was not really paid attention to until quite recently in other places in the continent. Bandha is also located in an interesting area ecologically in the wooded savanna that lies between savanna and forest ecological zones. What this means essentially is that the landscape is likely to see considerable change with varying precipitation. So this provides a good test case of whether or not people can cope with significant environmental shifts. So people have been living and working in Bandha over an extended period, and we have strong archaeological data from the last millennium all the way to the present day. This rich data set enabled me to look at continuity and change in foodways over what were some of the most tumultuous and dynamic times in world history, and when, for better or worse, our modern global food system took root. So my book covered the latter part of this sequence from 1400 to 2014, bolstered by an archaeological ethnography of food in the area. These phases straddle some significant political economic shifts. These included the height of the trans-Saharan trade, which we'll talk about more in a minute, as well as the gradual shift to Atlantic trade beginning for Bandha in the 17th century. The area was then taken over by two successive empires, first the Asante and later the British. So today I'm not going to have time to cover this whole sequence, but I am going to focus on the periods I shaded in red. So this is the period immediately preceding European contact, and then secondly, formal colonial rule beginning in the late 19th century. So in what follows, I'll give you a brief example of my approach by noting a few instances of scarcity slot reasoning in the literature, and then putting those stereotypes into conversation with the archaeological record. In particular, in this section, I'd like to focus on the closely interrelated imaginaries that Africans lack food and the ability to cope with environmental change. So I'll illustrate what I mean by talking about the introduction of American crops as part of the Columbian Exchange. Historians and archaeologists have long been fascinated by the spread of plants and animals post-Columbus. Alfred Crosby's famous book, It Only Really Heightened these interests. Unfortunately, in this book, as in most depictions of the Columbian Exchange, Africans tend to get short shrift, except as a source of slaves and other raw materials. Their agencies and pre-existing cultural developments are repeatedly silenced. So take for example this quote from Crosby, which summarizes his argument as far as Africa is concerned, and I quote, "The importance of American foods in Africa is more obvious than in any other continent of the Old World, for in no other continent, except the Americas themselves, is so great a proportion of the population dependent on American foods. Very few of man's cultivated plants originated in Africa, and so Africa has had to import its chief food plants from Asia and America. As for the influence of these crops before 1850, we might hypothesize that the increased food production enabled the slave trade to go on as long as it did without pumping the black well of Africa dry." Now I could critique this argument and its racist undertones all day, and many scholars certainly have done so in similar languages used in other contexts. But what is remarkable about the literature on African foodways is that the root assumptions at play here tend to go unquestioned. While published originally in 1972, Crosby's work was substantially revised in 2003, yet this language was left intact. The key assumption that Crosby makes here, based on absolutely no empirical data, is that Africans were in need of American crops like maize post-1492. That Africans needed additional food because they themselves did not have adequate supplies has continued to be repeated even in much more recent works like those of James McCann, published in 2005. Clearly heavily influenced by Jared Diamond as well, McCann, an environmental historian, depicts Africans as disadvantaged by virtue of geographic inevitability, lacking enough food supplies to develop all the hallmarks of complexity. His evidence for this is relatively weak. He uses the relative unpopularity of African grains in the modern global food market, where Eurasian grains and wheat and rice and American maize dominate. But this pattern speaks more of modern geopolitical relationships and their impact on global food preferences, rather than the capabilities of African versus European grains. Now, each of these scholars has otherwise done exceptional work, and I really want to emphasize that here. So perhaps what is so jarring here is that they uncritically promote the kinds of assumptions I'm calling attention to. This underscores, I think, just how pervasive assumptions of scarcity are where African food is concerned. What all of these arguments have in common is the lack of empirical data to support their arguments. Yet they go largely unquestioned because they fit easily into the commonly held trope that Africa is a place that lacks the ability to produce enough food for itself and thus is in need of external assistance. The implicit assumption here is that Africans were incapable of modifying and creating their environments. So what I'd like to turn to now is an empirical examination of how crops like maize were actually adopted in the area I work in as an empirical test of sorts to some of these assumptions of scarcity. So most of these arguments have been based upon the advantages of American crops over African ones. This makes sense in a sort of situation where you don't have a lot of data on the spread and adoption of American crops, but this sort of after effect is that it effectively ends up giving the crops themselves more agency than African people. So I argue that it's important to consider the affordances of these crops, but only to understand the conditions under which people might have chosen to adopt them. So to illustrate what I mean by this, I reproduced Bandha's agricultural cycle as it was in 2009, and I note the year here because things have likely changed by now again. Climate change has really radically altered rainfall patterns in recent decades and continues to do so. What I'd like to direct your attention to is the seasonal production schedule of African crops, namely yams, pearl millet, and sorghum. Note that they're not ready to harvest until August at the earliest. In modern Bandha, this means that by June and July, food supplies often run short, as last year's harvest of pearl millet and sorghum run out and before yams are basically ready to harvest. This period is known as the hungry season gap. This is a chronic and seasonal shortage that affects very large numbers of people on the African continent, and I would say is the primary food challenge. So today, two crops from the Americas, maize and cassava, help make up this shortfall, since they're ready to harvest right in the middle of the hungry season gap. Two crops of maize can also be grown per year instead of just one in the case of African grains, and this potentially doubles yield then per plot of land. Both of these factors supposedly transformed African foodways by increasing the amount of able to be harvested, assuming that farmers in the past valued yield above all else, and by plugging the hungry season gap, which is often assumed to have characterized ancient African societies as well. So in modern Africa, chronic and seasonal shortages like the hungry season gap act to make people more vulnerable to severe climatic shocks like drought. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, a severe drought followed a humid period, leading to severe famine throughout the Sahel. This marked the beginning of a drying trend that has continued through to the present and has had devastating impacts on food production throughout the region, including in Bandha. But if these effects are bad, what about this major drought of a magnitude order more severe and prolonged that bracketed the period precisely when American crops like maize were introduced? If people were as vulnerable to drought as they are today, this mega drought would have had catastrophic impacts on their ability to feed themselves. In particular, we'd expect people to make up for decreased harvests by clinging to American crops that would help plug food shortages. So what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is evaluate whether or not this is the case in Bandha. While we can use multiple kinds of archaeological data to answer this question, in this slide I really want to focus on archaeological plant remains. Plant remains afford us a view of how people engaged with and created their environments, and how they manage changing economic, environmental, and political conditions through food and agriculture. As an aside, this is primarily the macrobotanical data for those archaeobotany nerds in the room. I also conducted pilot phytolith and starch grain studies at these sites, but these are, and while these are high-resolution techniques which can radically transform our study of food in the past, doing this kind of work in Africa is really at a sort of early stage, so that's something I'm sort of building towards. The macrobotanical data instead seem to provide a much more robust records of the kind of changes I was looking for. So this data is basically an amalgamation of seed data from 330 samples from 10 different sites over the last 1,000 years, and this essentially gives us a regional view of changing foodways in agriculture. I'm going to focus here on presenting the story of changes in staple grains grown in the area over time, because I think this best illustrates the emergence of food insecurity. So if you've been trying to read this graph and you can't, it's not you, it's me. I purposely omitted some information to try and situate what this graph is trying to display, but also foreground the analytical measures I've used. So these data span 81,000 to the mid-19th century, and this timeline's on the bottom horizontal. This also encompasses, though, a number of changing rainfall regimes, and those are indicated at the top horizontal axis. The top histogram shows ubiquity measures, which is essentially the percentage of context we find a plant in. On the bottom is frequency relative to other grains, so how much pearl millet relative to maize, etc. Together they provide a rough idea of how common a plant was, as well as what quantity it was used. So what you'll see immediately is that pearl millet dominates for the entire sequence until we get to the tail end. This crop is indigenous to Africa and the earliest domesticated crop on the continent. We find it all over the place. It's in domestic contexts as well as ritual ones, and indeed it remains one of the most ritually potent crops even today. Now, sorghum is another African domesticate, but it's a little bit different. It's present, but used a lot more in wet periods and less in dry ones. Now, this makes a lot of sense for farmers, as sorghum is tolerant of wetter conditions, whereas pearl millet is not. Bandha actually lies at the extreme wet edge of pearl millet cultivation, so the fact that it's the main staple there in an area that was not really environmentally optimal speaks, I think, to the great cultural value it had. And I'll have to say this is also supported by archaeobotanical analysis done at a number of sites, even in the middle of dense tropical forests, where we surprisingly find pearl millet where it absolutely should not be there. So finally, this is maize. It comes in during the Couleau phase, which lasts from 1450 to 1650, and we've done some direct AMS dates on that, and it corresponds with the latter part of that sequence, between about 1590 to 1630. This is actually a pretty quick arrival into the area. Our earliest dates on the coast are mid-1500s, so within basically a generation it's moved 400 kilometers inland. But if you look at the pattern of its deposition, it's actually pretty rare. We find it only in one house out of 4 tested. It's completely missing from over 100 other samples from other contexts, including really dense middens. This restricted adoption pattern suggests a crop that's adopted more out of luxury rather than out of need. In fact, as you can see here, maize actually continues to be relatively minor, even well into the 19th century, and this is despite a return to wet conditions. It seems then that farmers were not, at least in the first few centuries of its introduction, were not desperate for maize's ability to increase yield or plug the hungry season gap until much later. But perhaps what is most compelling about this archaeobotanical sequence is not maize or its low representation, but the pearl millet. I argue our focus on the introduction of American crops and their affordances have effectively silenced the major role played by indigenous African grains, which provided food for people during the worst drought on record in the last millennium. Indeed, the focus on maize is due to a fascination with a set of Western neo-evolutionary ideals that privileged the production of surplus above all other goals. African agriculture has largely been structured around a different goal, that of risk reduction and resilience. Pearl millet's ability to withstand drought and maintain cultural food preferences suggests that farmers knew exactly what they were doing. As I'm going to argue in the next few minutes, I think the evidence also suggests that people weren't just getting by, they were thriving. So while this drought surely had an impact on crop production and thus food availability, we don't see evidence of coping mechanisms that would otherwise indicate food insecurity. So while wild plants, for example, continue to be used, none of these are known famine foods or replacements for staple crops. Instead, they're species that added taste and texture. The same is true of the wide range of animal species utilized, some of which seem to have been selected for their novelty or rarity rather than ease of capture, which is a pattern we find more in later periods. Indeed, many of these animals, such as the great white shark, and I'll just pause here to say this is 400 kilometers away from any ocean, so this had to travel quite a distance, or perhaps the various predatory cats, were probably luxury items rather than food sort of adopted out of need. Many of these animals were traded in from other ecological zones, and many others were very dangerous animals that attest to skilled hunters knowledgeable of their surrounding environments. In short, people utilized a diverse array of animal and plant species, both local and exotic, to satisfy what seemed to be quite cosmopolitan tastes. So although pearl millet helped ensure adequate food supplies, Bandha's socioeconomic positionality also afforded the area a degree of resilience to environmental change. We see clear evidence for involvement in northward directed trade networks, as well as evidence for vibrant regional trade. People acquired raw materials like copper from Saharan sources and fashioned them into all sorts of copper objects like the ring pictured here locally. This points to poor skilled metal workers in the area. Beads trickle in from across the Sahara from as far away as Afghanistan. Ivory and possibly gold is produced locally and likely traded both north and south. There's also evidence for production of crafts consumed more on a local and regional scale, like pottery and iron objects. We have growing evidence that people were organized along specialist craft producer lines and produced a surplus of many craft goods such as iron. This provides circumstantial evidence, at least, that there may have been enough food to go around. Otherwise, these highly valued specialists could have simply voted with their feet. Now, this world of interconnected and productive craftspeople and traders does not fit easily with imaginaries of an Africa plagued by the worst drought on record over the last millennium, and demands a reevaluation of the idea that Africans were in need when Europeans landed on the coast. What tends to go overlooked in studies like those of McCann and Crosby is local context, and this effectively sanitizes a historical record of African knowledges, desires, and agencies. By the time Columbus mistakenly landed on the shores of the Caribbean islands, West Africa had for centuries been the hub of some of the most lucrative trade networks in the world. These networks moved goods, including foods, from the Middle East and Europe into Africa and vice versa, as well as between ecological zones in West Africa. Perhaps the best-known character in these exchanges is Mansa Musa, a king of Mali who made the pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century and gave away so much gold that he is said to have depressed world markets. While Musa's experience certainly did not define the experiences of every African living at that time, tales like this paint a much different imaginary of Africa than the scarcity mentality allows for. It was, of course, the very promise of bountiful resources that lured Europeans to West African coastlines in the 15th century. Yet the positionality of some Africans was to change dramatically in the centuries to follow, as Europeans shifted from trading gold and other commodities to human beings. This trade peaked in Ghana itself throughout the 18th century. While I have data that pertain to the transatlantic slave trade, what I'd actually like to do is skip ahead to the 19th century in order to talk about how such changes became flattened into stereotypes of timelessness. So fast forward a few hundred years in your mind. So by the 19th century, Africa was still viewed as a land of abundance, but her people were viewed pejoratively. By the onset of colonial rule in the late 19th century, most officials adhered to the myth of tropical exuberance, the idea that African environments were rich and overflowing in resources, but that African people lacked the will or the way to effectively control and mine them. This view effectively invoked a historical amnesia of sorts, ignoring the centuries of ruinous slaving that had upended whole villages and reduced population drastically in many areas, with major impacts, of course, on agricultural production. This ahistorical colonial ideology also helped justify the exploitation of African resources while simultaneously ignoring food and agriculture, since it was assumed that rich tropical environments yielded ample food supplies without Africans really having to try very hard. What this meant was that beginning in 1896, when the British first extended rule over much of what was now the Gold Coast colony, until the mid-20th century, there was very little attention paid to subsistence crops or agriculture outside of cash crops. This no-policy policy, that's what I like to call it, towards food crops, has inclined some to assume that British rule had but a negligible impact on agricultural production and food security. One of the most recent manifestations of this view is provided in a recent article by economic historian Paul Schaefer. He argues that food insecurity was more a function of already existing practices and the limitation of African environments. I'd like to spend a moment here dissecting how Schaefer's argument is constructed in order to illustrate how scarcity is reinforced by assumptions of timelessness that tend to be used to paper over apparent discrepancies in pre-colonial data. So here I should mention that Schaefer's case also demonstrates why these kinds of debates matter. Economists have taken an increasing interest in African history, and they have a much bigger voice in policy making than anthropologists tend to. Unlike the authors I discussed in the last section, I also want to emphasize, though, that Schaefer actually has a much higher standard of data. He's to be commended for drawing on interdisciplinary sources, including linguistics, history, and ethnography, to address pre-colonial food security. Now, he focuses on northern Ghana, a little bit north of where Bandha is. This is an area that today suffers the most from food insecurity out of anywhere in the modern country of Ghana, and to which Bandha is closely situated in terms of the colonial dynamics and economic policies. The sum total of his evidence for food insecurity derived from two European travelers who visited the area in 1899 and 1906, a few years after formal colonial rule was extended. These sources record local words for hunger, which he argues implies the existence of hunger prior to British colonial rule. Unfortunately, he is not able to provide any detailed glosses, for example, whether these words simply refer to "I'm hungry, that food that you all are eating smells good," or to severe famine, two very different concepts. And the vast pre-colonial period is collapsed into what two Europeans could record on very brief visits in 1899 and 1906. These dates, of course, also fall within the colonial period. Although Schaefer acknowledges these are weak sources, he nevertheless argues that the hunger season existed before colonial rule, despite not a single source that alludes to the specific type of seasonal food insecurity. What is perhaps most stunning to me is the great logical gymnastics to which authors like Schaefer go to let colonial interventions off the hook, in spite of what I'm going to argue is considerable evidence to the contrary. What Schaefer does not mention is the well-known historical context of the time, that many regions in Ghana, especially the north that is his focus, were subject to tremendous upheaval in the decades immediately preceding his sources. This was a direct result of the British outlawing the transatlantic slave trade in 1807 and the subsequent shift to so-called legitimate trade goods like palm oil. The production of these agricultural cash crops required considerable labor, and this led to a ramping up of the internal slave trade. At the same time, African leaders with imperial designs like Imam Samori captured large parts of the interior of the subcontinent, bringing with them extreme levels of violence. Bandha oral histories, for example, tell of people fleeing the violence, leaving farm and home behind, and even abandoning relatives. In these stories, they say they had to eat whatever they could find, even trying new species of wild leaves, one person at a time, to make sure they didn't kill them. In short, this was a period of the most severe food insecurity on record in the last 1,000 years, though it's glossed by Schaefer as typical of the pre-colonial period. What I suggest here is that the period he's focusing on is quite the opposite of representative of food security in the entirety of the millennium-long pre-colonial period. So after decades of violence and upheaval, when people resettled in Bandha in the 1890s, there was a new normal. Because of the long pre-colonial record available to us, we can see just how abnormal this pattern is, a visibility not accorded to those who rely on written evidence alone. Houses were made of less durable materials, trade and craft production had greatly contracted, and people had shifted to maize and perhaps cassava as staple foods. These food shifts are significant in terms of food security. Maize, as I've discussed, is one of the fastest producing crops, and cassava can be grown with very little labor. Both were likely important affordances in the low labor situations Bandha people found themselves in the early colonial period, when populations were extremely low and yet colonial authorities still called up men to work on colonial projects. By comparing these data with ceramic production patterns, we interpret this as a shift indicative of women and older individuals shouldering a greater responsibility of the farming burden. Finally, maize and cassava fulfill an important role today in bridging the hungry season gap, when crops from the previous harvest run out and before the next one is ready. Their dominance in the early colonial period, but not before, suggests that the hungry season gap, the most prevalent kind of food insecurity in the continent today, may well be a modern invention. And Bandha does not seem to have been the only place that experienced a decline in food security. What I've illustrated here are data on heights from a recent study by economic historian Gareth Austin and colleagues. Now, height is in part genetic, but it's also strongly determined by nutrition early in life, particularly protein intake. So each of these lines represents heights of men born in the sort of time range that's listed in different regions of Ghana. What I want to draw your attention to is that each of these regions show a marked decline in the heights of men born between 1895 and 1904. This suggests a marked increase in malnutrition during this period. I don't think it's a coincidence that this correlates precisely with the time that people in Bandha shift to maize and cassava. Together, these data suggest a marked decline in food security in the early colonial period and may well signal an increasingly severe hunger season. So while there was no specific policy of colonial authorities that intentionally caused food insecurity, the interaction of local historical contingencies and the laissez-faire imposition of capitalist market economies seem to have had major impacts. As we know from Bandha and elsewhere, many places were in the early stages of recovering from severe demographic collapse. Much of West Africa at this time was subject to violence and associated dislocation as various political entities attempted to control resources and people. This followed on the heels of the human losses that had occurred as a result of the Atlantic slave trade the previous century. Colonial officials, of course, had to make money from their new colony, so they pushed the production of cash crops and strongly encouraged market participation, including for rural people the selling of crop produce and purchasing of imported goods from the metropole, probably goals too. People did not have the labor to produce what they used to, and they were pressured to sell what little they had at market. This meant that the food that would have normally gotten a family through the year now ran short before the next harvest. People had to buy food during these shortfalls, but prices were often double the norm, following the supply and demand logic of capitalist markets. Many people took to borrowing to feed their families, but this would mean they would sell harvests as soon as they were ready to repay loans. The next year, then, they often found themselves in a similar situation. Market economies can be tremendously unforgiving when it comes to hunger, because they have an inertia all their own. Once experienced, it becomes practically impossible to escape the cycle. It took 4 decades for colonial officials to realize that they had a major nutritional crisis on their hands. Beginning in the 1930s, medical officers armed with the techniques of a new nutritional science found alarmingly high levels of malnutrition in parts of the African colonies. F.M. Purcell, a medical doctor, was assigned to Ghana, and the image depicted here is from his grisly 1939 report that systematically linked poor nutrition with health problems. I selected this picture as the least graphic among them, but one which still bears witness to the tragic nutritional deficiencies of the era. Some colonies responded by creating new national food policies, but others actively prevented reports like these from ever seeing the light of day and did nothing. The British Gold Coast was unfortunately among the latter. Purcell, in fact, completed a nutritional survey of northern Ghana, where in the early 40s he found even more severe nutritional deficiencies than reported in this earlier report which focused on the coast. But his write-up on northern Ghana was prevented from ever being published, since it made the colony look bad. As one official scrawled on his draft report, "No one may starve in the British Empire." Instead, these deficiencies were recast not as a problem of empire, but as a natural feature of African environments and their backward agricultural practices, a recasting which has remained remarkably tenacious and popular in even some scholarly circles. Yet archaeological reconstructions of food security suggest a very different pattern, one which not only challenges the idea that the hungry season gap is a natural part of the agricultural cycle, but one which points a determined finger at colonial negligence. In this way, I propose that archaeology in the past be used as an active corrective to the forced forgetting that it was and is part and parcel of the colonial project. Although I've only covered them in brief today, what these data show is a relatively high level of food security during the worst drought on record in the last millennium, suggesting a high degree of resilience to environmental change that was somehow lost before now. That moment of loss seems to be that in the 19th and early 20th century, as violence, both political and structural, plagued the countryside. Now, I'm not alone, of course, in arguing that the colonial project had devastating impacts on food security in the colonies. My data reinforce and extend what political ecologists like Michael Watts and Mike Davis have shown in other regions, that colonial interventions and their market prerogatives had devastating impacts on local food security. Davis also shows how colonial officials repeatedly and deliberately silenced the severity of famines induced by colonial policies in order to save face at home. Archaeology is one way we can help overturn those silences, but also allows us to do something more by demonstrating high food security in the centuries preceding European interventions. Archaeology provides a temporality that no one else can, allowing us a glimpse at processes that occur over the long array. I argue that the emergence of chronic food insecurity is akin to what Rob Nixon calls slow violence, quote, a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and nutritional violence that is not typically viewed as violence at all, end quote. Because these impacts are displaced in time, they're frequently disconnected from their ultimate causes. Those deeply enmeshed in turbo-capitalism, with its attendant focus on the fast-paced and catastrophic, tend to overlook gradual and slow processes of change. But overlooking processes of slow violence decouples them from their causes, with serious consequences for how we envision their solutions. The image of timeless Africa remains particularly tenacious and popular in even some development circles where it can do serious damage. This is especially the case for food security. Here I quote from a journalist's best-selling account of an NGO working in East Africa, typical of this genre. Modern farmers are portrayed as toiling away in a time warp, denying coevalness to the tragedies of the present that are very much informed by the past. Such images portray food insecurity as fixable with the right technological training, but in so doing, they minimize the histories of creative agricultural responses that African farmers have made to drought economic change. They also depoliticize food insecurity, rerouting blame away from a flawed world system to technologically backward African farmers. Archaeology provides one means of building alternate narratives that can help challenge these dominant modes of thinking with empirical data. In my book, I focus on tracking capabilities and culpabilities over time to build a new narrative of African food history. Put another way, this approach attends to the unfolding of structural violence over time as high potential for food security was eroded away through centuries of marginalization. This, of course, is not a unidirectional narrative, for the capabilities of people to survive the most trying of environmental, economic, and political changes is clear in recent times as well. In the last couple chapters of the book, I return to the last few decades and consider how people in Bandha negotiate a simultaneous hunger for modernity as well as actual seasonal hunger. In so doing, I aim to jar and upset figures like this one, which take on a firmness and a predictability that effectively silences African capabilities and desires, as well as their roles in building new futures. This is part of what I see as a much larger, long-term research and writing project to document and compare capabilities and culpabilities over time and space, within Africa, but also beyond. Today, there's an arguably greater political need to promote the qualities and capabilities of local African food systems than ever before. Multinational agribusiness is making a run on Africa's genetic crop resources, and their devaluation only facilitates this knowledge theft. Climate change projections predict a dire decrease in yields if the continent's agricultural production as present today does not change. This has served as a call to action for big biotech, who claim that Africa had the most to gain from GMO technology. But biotechnology is yet the newest iteration of transnational development machines, whose very existence depends on the scarcity slot. A worldview where Africans lack food and the ability to do anything about it themselves because they're hopelessly stuck in the past both justifies and legitimizes this kind of thinking. But what if we consider an alternate reality, where such stereotypes are replaced instead with empirically grounded narratives drawn from the past? This kind of imagining also reinforces precisely why history matters for resetting future possibilities. What if, for example, the Africa we heard about on the news was one that had pioneered sustainable organic agriculture? What if Africans were looked to as sources of inspiration for dealing with 21st century climate change, given people's long histories of experimentation and successful adaptation to climatic variability? And the list could go on. The thing is, neither of these what ifs are hypothetical. Each is grounded in empirical research. The only reason that they're not commonplace views in today's world are the consistent, repeated, and wholly entrenched stereotypes about the continent that I call the scarcity slot. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. So we have plenty of time for questions. So, questions?
In regard to Jared Diamond, I
Yes.
think his argument is not that Africans were less talented, rather it's that the environment itself lacked certain resources. So a two-part question. If you took your model and pushed it way back, if you showed that woman cooking for her children, what plants and animals, if you pushed it far enough back, would be outside of Africa itself? This is later when you have Europeans arrive and bring things from the Americas. What is she cooking? Is she cooking sorghum, or is she cooking millet? In other words, if you went way back, would you see that a lot of plants and animals come outside, which is some degree Jared Diamond's doing?
Well, you know, Jared Diamond, I have to applaud him for taking such a broad view of world history. I also think he's the favorite person for anthropologists, particularly archaeology. But his work has really had a sort of stunning impact, also in sort of thinking about geography and history and how they relate to the modern day. Jared Diamond does overlook, though, some really important information about early agriculture in Africa. Africa sort of plays a sort of, gets very short shrift in his books, and part of his reasoning is that there were fewer sort of large grains and animals to domesticate from his sort of view, but the fact is people did, right? They domesticated sorghum, they domesticated pearl nut, they domesticated yams, as well as a whole host. And until basically, 1550, that's what people relied on for many millennia. Now, you're right that there were other crops that came in from other parts of the world, particularly bananas, which comes in actually quite early along the East African coast and spreads fairly rapidly. That is definitely true. In West Africa, bananas, plantains do not reach the area until what they actually around the time of Europeans. To answer your question,
Just to follow up, isn't there a danger in your model that the outside world could say, we have no obligation any longer to Africa. If they take care of themselves, and we could have a catastrophe in certain parts of Africa because of climate change.
Yeah, I agree that there is danger. I'm actually quite careful on how I present that in the book version. You could sort of be led to that conclusion if you didn't read the part that talks about how, the structural inequalities that have created the modern day hunger season. So there's both, in stressing both capabilities and culpabilities, I'm trying to sort of account for that, but that is something that is on my mind in terms of how it's received. Hence a book rather than a shorter version, but who knows who will look at the book, right?
Yeah.
Thanks so much for that. It was great. Yes, one of the questions I had thinking about the construction of the scarcity slot was really persuasive. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how, despite such incredible work on the making of scarcity as a process that involves much larger colonial history and violence, why the scarcity, idea of food scarcity continue to persist despite despite the work that we know that there's enough food in the world and calories in the world. What animates the figure of scarcity to give it such force?
I think it relates to development, and this is built on work of James Ferguson and all sorts of other people who have a lot of the critical work and critical development. We need to think of Africa as a certain kind of place that is forever scarce in order to create the need that then modern development fills, right? And so I think the pressures are incredibly strong from pretty much every level, from the people who are in positions of power to direct resources and how they're spent, right? I think there's also this sort of hero narrative that sort of builds, does some important mental work for people in the West thinking about development, about Africa's problems, right? I think there's a lot of complex layers there of which I would actually, I think critical development would have done a better job explaining than me. But my goal here really was I was heavily influenced by Ferguson's work in particular, was what if we sort of push this back into deep time? How can we make these deep histories talk to what development's doing, what critical development are, and how can we use the empirical database that archaeologists are so good at coming up with to sort of stretch the imagination a little bit in productive ways. But one thing that I constantly was thinking about writing the book was there's lots of Africans who have come before me, like Ferguson, like many others, who have written books saying, stop thinking about Africa in these stereotypical terms, but yet it still happens. So the question then is how to sort of move forward if that's even possible, which is not a great place to end your book, and so I don't, but
thank you for really interesting talk. Just following up on Nikhil, which is not my question, but in a way it kind of fits in. I mean, obviously that's racism too, right? Half centuries of colonial violence, sort of undermining our understanding of certain people as human. But I was actually interested in how you configured the scarcity slot in relation to the savage slot, and talking about the scarcity, which links to your comment about development just now, to modernization theory, and the savage slot to what Trullo says about colonial history, etc. And then you further went down in the modernization theory into resources, so it becomes a preoccupation with resources or lack thereof. And in the savage slot, you had manners, which innate characteristics or traits, or within that kind of language. And I wanted to hear you talk more about the extent to which you see these things actually as distinct, or whether you understand some of modernization theory's tenets also as being rooted in this kind of conceptualization of innate being or lack, because your data, or the perpetuation of the idea that lack is what characterizes Africa